It could go another 100 years. It could be tomorrow. It could be, the very next minute. That's not a line pulled from a disaster movie script. That's Dr. Lucy Jones, the Caltech seismologist, who has spent nearly 4 decades studying Southern California's fault systems, answering a straightforward question about when the earthquake everyone calls the big one is actually going to strike. And her answer, delivered without any dramatic flourish, without any specific date attached to it, is exactly what's driving a wave of headlines across the country right now. Headlines using words like chilling, dire, and panic. Here's the thing worth sitting with before we go any further. Jones isn't predicting an earthquake tomorrow. No credible seismologist on the planet is claiming they can pinpoint the exact day a major fault will rupture. But what she and a growing stack of new research are saying is something arguably more unsettling than a specific date would be. The San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems running through Southern California are now believed to be carrying more accumulated stress than at any point in the last 1,000 years. And a second, entirely separate study just added a genuinely alarming new wrinkle. Evidence that a massive earthquake off the coast of Oregon and Washington could reach south and set off Southern California's fault system within hours. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what these studies actually found, what the big one would really look like if it happened, why scientists who spend their careers being cautious about overstating risk are suddenly using language this direct, and what you can genuinely take away from all of this without spiraling into panic over a risk that has technically existed for centuries. If this is the kind of story that affects how you think about where you live or what you're prepared for, stick around. And if you want more of these deep, fact-checked breakdowns instead of the exaggerated version flooding your feed, subscribing genuinely helps. Let's start with the fault itself, because understanding what the San Andreas actually is makes everything that follows make a lot more sense. The San Andreas Fault is the boundary where the Pacific tectonic plate and the North American tectonic plate grind directly against each other, stretching roughly 800 miles from the Salton Sea in Southern California, up through the Bay Area and beyond. The southern portion of the San Andreas, the stretch running closest to Los Angeles and San Bernardino, last ruptured in a major event back in 1857, the Fort Tejon earthquake, estimated at magnitude 7.9. That's 169 years ago. For nearly a century and 3/4, that section of fault has been locked, quietly accumulating strain from the Pacific and North American plates continuing to grind past each other the entire time. UCLA earthquake engineering professor Jonathan Stewart has noted that major ruptures along the San Andreas tend to occur roughly every 150 years based on the geological record, which means this particular segment isn't just overdue in some vague, hand-wavy sense. It's sitting well past its typical historical interval, carrying more than a century and a half of unreleased stress with essentially nowhere for that energy to go except into an eventual, sudden slip. This is where the newest research enters the picture and gives that overdue status some genuinely hard numbers to work with. A study conducted by researchers, including Dr. Lilian Burkhardt, built a physics-based model reconstructing 1,000 years of stress history along both the San Andreas and the neighboring San Jacinto fault system, feeding it geological evidence like radiocarbon-dated sediment displacement and centuries of historical earthquake records, then running the simulation forward to today to calculate current stress levels. The output is about as direct as scientific modeling gets. Stress on the San Jacinto-San Bernardino segment is now calculated at 3.6 megapascals, the highest value found anywhere across the entire 1,000-year reconstruction. The nearby San Andreas Mojave South segment is sitting at 2.8 megapascals, also significantly elevated. And critically, both of those numbers are closely aligned with each other, a configuration the researchers found matches the exact pattern that preceded past instances where ruptures jumped across both fault systems simultaneously rather than staying contained to just one. Researchers are careful to note these are modeled values built on the assumptions baked into the simulation rather than direct physical measurements pulled from underground, which is an important caveat. But even with that caveat attached, the finding lines up with earlier reporting on this same research showing that stress across the broader San Andreas and San Jacinto system has reached its highest point in a millennium, a data point serious enough that it's been independently referenced by multiple research teams studying the region. To understand why researchers are so specifically worried about these two fault systems interacting, rather than treating them as separate, isolated hazards, you need to understand a geographic choke point called Cajon Pass, a mountain corridor roughly 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles where the San Andreas and San Jacinto faults physically meet. Burkhardt's research team describes this junction using a specific and genuinely useful term, an earthquake gate, a structural feature capable of either stopping a rupture cold in its tracks or letting it pass through and cascade onto the neighboring fault, turning what would have been a single fault earthquake into a combined multi-fault event covering a much larger stretch of Southern California at once. History offers examples of both outcomes. The 1857 Fort Tejon earthquake, the same magnitude in 7.9 event that's now been quiet for 169 years, stopped right at that gate rather than spreading further. But the 1812 Wrightwood earthquake is believed to have done the opposite, crossing through Cajon Pass and rupturing both fault systems together. If a joint rupture happened today, crossing that same gate under current stress conditions, the study estimates it could produce an earthquake somewhere between magnitude 7, 4, and 7. 8, an event large enough to simultaneously threaten the Los Angeles Basin, San Bernardino, Riverside County, and the Coachella Valley all at once, rather than concentrating damage along a single, more contained fault line. USC seismologist Ahmed Ilbana, who directs the statewide California Earthquake Center, has summarized the uncertainty around exactly when that might happen about as honestly as any scientist could. It could be today, tomorrow, in 10 years, or in 30 years, and on a geological timescale, there's genuinely no meaningful difference between those possibilities. Now, if that were the entire story, it would already be a significant piece of science journalism worth covering carefully. But a second, largely independent line of research published this year has added a layer of concern that goes well beyond Southern California on its own, when it's arguably the more genuinely novel finding driving this week's fresh round of headlines. Researchers at Oregon State University, led by marine geologist Chris Goldfinger, spent years drilling and analyzing deep-sea sediment cores off the Pacific coast, extracting a physical record stretching back roughly 3,100 years. Buried within those cores are distinct layers called turbidites, sediment deposits laid down by underwater landslides, the kind of landslides that get triggered specifically by strong earthquake shaking. By comparing turbidite layers pulled from sediment near the Cascadia subduction zone, the massive fault running offshore from Northern California up through Oregon, Washington, and into British Columbia, against turbidite layers from the northern San Andreas fault, Goldfinger's team found something that surprised even the researchers who'd spent years hypothesizing it might be possible. In at least 3 separate instances across the last 1,500 years, including the most recent major Cascadia rupture back in the year 1700, the timing and structural pattern of the sediment layers strongly suggest that the Cascadia and San Andreas fault systems ruptured within just minutes to hours of each other, not as 2 unrelated coincidences occurring in the same general era, but as a linked cascading sequence, one massive earthquake, seemingly setting off the other in rapid succession. Goldfinger has been direct about what that finding actually means for how emergency planners need to think about worst-case scenarios along the entire West Coast. For years, the dominant fear driving Pacific Northwest disaster planning has been a single catastrophic Cascadia rupture on its own, a magnitude 9 or higher event capable of producing violent shaking lasting several minutes, not the 10 to 30 seconds typical of a more contained earthquake, followed by a devastating tsunami surging into coastal communities from Northern California through Oregon, Washington, and up into Vancouver Island. That scenario alone, Goldfinger points out, would already draw down disaster response resources from across the entire country just to manage it. But if the San Andreas gets triggered in the same compressed window, potentially within hours of Cascadia rupturing, you're no longer looking at a single regional disaster. You're looking at San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, all managing catastrophic damage simultaneously, each region unable to send meaningful mutual aid to any of the others because every one of them is dealing with its own crisis at the exact same time. Althea Rizzo, the Geologic Hazards Program Coordinator at the Oregon Department of Emergency Management, has emphasized just how different the shaking itself would feel compared to what most Californians associate with a typical quake. A Cascadia scale event isn't the sharp 10 to 30 second jolt people are used to from a crustal earthquake. It's minutes of continuous, rolling shaking, an entirely different physical experience, and one that catches a lot of people off guard specifically because it doesn't match what they've mentally rehearsed for. It's worth being genuinely careful here about what this research does and doesn't claim, because the language showing up in some coverage has run ahead of what the underlying science actually supports. The Oregon State study found evidence of correlation and plausible triggering mechanisms across a handful of historical instances within a very long geological record, not a guarantee that every future Cascadia rupture will automatically trigger the San Andreas, and not a specific prediction about when the next Cascadia event will happen at all. Emergency planners in Oregon currently work from an estimated 30 to 50-year window for the probability of a full Cascadia rupture. Itself, a wide range reflecting genuine scientific uncertainty rather than a hard deadline. What the study adds isn't a countdown clock. It's a previously underappreciated worst-case scenario that hazard planners now have to seriously account for. The possibility that when Cascadia does eventually rupture, it might not stay a Pacific Northwest problem, and the entire West Coast mutual aid and disaster response framework, largely built around the assumption that unaffected regions can send help to whichever area gets hit, may not hold up if multiple major cities are dealing with catastrophic damage in the same narrow window of time. So let's actually talk about what a major San Andreas rupture would look like on the ground, because this is where Lucy Jones's work becomes central to the conversation. Back in 2008, Jones led the development of what's become known as the shakeout scenario, a detailed simulation of a magnitude 7/8 rupture along the southern San Andreas Fault, built using the best seismological, engineering, and geological data available at the time and refined extensively since. That scenario didn't just estimate a single number for shaking intensity. It modeled how a rupture starting near the Salton Sea and propagating northwest toward Los Angeles would actually behave, predicting nearly 2 minutes of strong shaking across the Los Angeles basin, an extraordinarily long duration compared to the typical earthquake most Southern Californians have actually experienced firsthand. The scenario projected hundreds of deaths, widespread building collapses, particularly among older, non-retrofitted structures called soft-story or non-ductile concrete buildings, and damage estimated in the tens of billions of dollars, along with cascading failures across water systems, the electrical grid, and transportation networks that could take months, not days, to fully restore. Jones has drawn a specific comparison between what a major San Andreas rupture would look like and the devastating earthquake sequence that struck Venezuela in 2025, another example of a major transform fault rupture. The same basic mechanism as the San Andreas, striking a densely populated area with catastrophic results. Jones has explained that unlike some other categories of natural disaster, seismologists actually understand this particular hazard extremely well. They know roughly how the rupture will propagate, they know what the resulting shaking will feel like across different parts of the region, and they know which categories of buildings are most likely to fail. What they don't know, and what no amount of additional research is likely to ever tell them with precision, is the specific day it will happen. That gap between understanding the mechanism thoroughly and being fundamentally unable to predict the timing is really the central tension running through this entire story, and it's worth explaining honestly rather than glossing over. Unlike hurricanes, which meteorologists can track and forecast days in advance as they form and move, or even certain types of volcanic unrest, where gradually building pressure sometimes provides weeks or months of escalating warning signs, earthquakes along a fault like the San Andreas typically strike with no reliable, universally accepted short-term precursor. There's no established scientific method for saying, with confidence, that a specific fault segment will rupture within the next week or month based on any currently measurable signal. Researchers have spent decades searching for reliable precursors, subtle shifts in groundwater chemistry, small foreshock patterns, minor changes in ground deformation, and while some of those signals have occasionally appeared before individual earthquakes in hindsight, none of them have proven reliable enough to build an actual forecasting system around. This is exactly why Jones's "it could be tomorrow, it could be in 100 years" framing isn't scientific hedging or evasiveness. It's an accurate reflection of the genuine limits of current earthquake science, a field that can tell you with startling precision what a major rupture will do once it starts, while remaining fundamentally unable to tell you when that rupture will actually begin. What has changed, and what's driving this specific wave of coverage right now, isn't a sudden ability to predict timing. It's the growing weight of converging evidence pointing toward elevated risk from multiple independent angles at once. You've got the 1,000-year stress reconstruction showing the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems sitting at historically unprecedented stress levels. You've got the Cajon Pass earthquake gate research suggesting current conditions specifically resemble the pattern that preceded past joint ruptures across both fault systems. You've got the Oregon State sediment core research demonstrating that Cascadia and the San Andreas have plausibly triggered each other in rapid succession multiple times across the last millennium and a half. And you've got a fault segment near Los Angeles that's now gone significantly longer without rupturing than its typical historical interval suggests it should have. None of these individually constitutes a prediction. But taken together, they represent a genuinely unusual convergence of independent lines of evidence all pointing in the same general direction: more accumulated stress, more plausible pathways for a single rupture to cascade into something far larger, and less remaining buffer before that stress eventually has to release. That convergence is precisely why researchers, who are normally extremely careful about avoiding alarmist language, have started using noticeably more direct, urgent phrasing in their public communication over the past several months. It's also worth acknowledging that Southern California hasn't exactly been geologically quiet in the lead up to this latest round of research, and that background activity is part of why local seismologists have been watching conditions especially closely. Earlier this year, a magnitude 4.9 earthquake struck near Indio in the Coachella Valley, close to the San Andreas Fault itself, described at the time as the strongest quake to hit Southern California in nearly a year, and it was followed by a sustained sequence of aftershocks and additional smaller quakes in the same area over the following weeks. Separately, the community of San Ramon in the Bay Area experienced dozens of small earthquakes clustering in recent months, enough activity that even longtime residents in a region well accustomed to regular shaking described it as unusually persistent. Individually, neither of these swarms indicates an imminent major rupture, and seismologists are consistently clear that the vast majority of earthquake swarms never escalate into anything larger. But they do serve as a reminder that the fault systems underlying this entire conversation aren't some abstract, dormant hazard sitting quietly in a research paper. They're actively, continuously active right now, generating a steady background hum of smaller earthquakes even in the years and months before any hypothetical larger event. It's worth putting today's situation in the context of California's actual earthquake history, because the last century has already demonstrated exactly how devastating a major rupture on or near these fault systems can be, even at magnitudes smaller than what's being discussed for a full San Andreas or joint Cajon Pass rupture. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake, estimated at roughly magnitude 7.9, struck along the northern San Andreas Fault, and combined with the fires that broke out across the city in its aftermath, killed an estimated 3,000 people and destroyed roughly 80% of San Francisco, a disaster that fundamentally reshaped how American cities thought about building codes and fire response for generations afterward. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, magnitude 6.9, struck during the World Series, and despite being smaller and shorter in duration than the shakeout scenario Jones and her colleagues later modeled, still caused 63 deaths, thousands of injuries, and the collapse of a section of the Bay Bridge, along with a double-decker freeway in Oakland. And the 1994 Northridge earthquake, magnitude 6.7, struck a section of fault that wasn't even part of the well-mapped San Andreas system at all, a previously unknown blind thrust fault beneath the San Fernando Valley, and still managed to kill 57 people and cause an estimated $20 billion in damage, at the time the costliest natural disaster in American history. Each of those earthquakes was smaller, in most cases significantly smaller, than the magnitude 7, 8 to 7. 9 range researchers are now describing as increasingly likely for the next major San Andreas rupture, and each of them still produced widespread structural collapse, mass casualties, and damage costs that took years to fully recover from. That historical baseline is precisely why seismologists treat the current stress findings with the seriousness they do. This isn't a hypothetical hazard being discussed in the abstract. It's a fault system with an extensively documented track record of producing genuine catastrophe, now believed to be carrying more stored energy than it has at any point across the historical and geological record available to study. There's also a specific infrastructure and building stock dimension to this risk that deserves attention, because not every structure in California faces the same level of danger, and understanding that distinction matters for anyone trying to gauge their own personal exposure. Since the 1994 Northridge earthquake specifically, California has progressively tightened its seismic building codes, and modern construction, particularly anything built or significantly retrofitted within the last 2 decades, is generally engineered to flex and absorb shaking rather than collapse outright, following design principles refined specifically in response to lessons learned from past California earthquakes. But a substantial portion of the state's existing building stock predates those stricter standards. Older unreinforced masonry buildings, soft-story apartment complexes built with ground floor parking or retail space that leaves the structure weaker at its base, and non-ductile concrete buildings constructed before modern reinforcement techniques became standard, all remain scattered throughout Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside, and other communities that would sit closest to a major San Andreas rupture. Los Angeles has run mandatory retrofit programs specifically targeting soft-story buildings over the past decade, but the pace of that retrofitting work has been gradual, and thousands of vulnerable structures across the region remain only partially addressed. This is exactly the kind of building stock the shakeout scenario identified as the primary driver of its projected casualty estimates, not modern, well-engineered skyscrapers, which are generally designed to survive even severe shaking, but older, smaller residential and commercial buildings where retrofitting has lagged behind the scale of the actual hazard. The economic dimension of a major rupture along these fault systems is worth walking through as well, because the numbers involved are large enough to be genuinely difficult to fully absorb. The original shakeout scenario projected damage costs in the range of tens of billions of dollars from direct structural destruction alone, and more recent economic modeling incorporating the growth of Southern California's population and property values, since that original 2008 analysis suggests the real cost of a major rupture today could run considerably higher, into the hundreds of billions of dollars, once you factor in indirect economic losses, business interruption, and the extended timeline required to restore water, power, and transportation infrastructure across a region home to more than 20 million people. Unlike a hurricane, which typically damages a defined coastal strip while leaving inland infrastructure and supply chains largely intact, a major Southern California earthquake would simultaneously damage infrastructure across an enormous, densely populated metropolitan area all at once, straining every category of emergency response, construction labor, and building material simultaneously rather than allowing resources to be sequentially redirected the way they often can be for other disaster types. That's part of why Chris Goldfinger's warning about a combined Cascadia and San Andreas event carries so much weight among emergency planners specifically. It's not simply that the shaking would be worse in any one location. It's that the entire West Coast's capacity to send mutual aid, National Guard support, and emergency construction resources from one affected region to another would be simultaneously overwhelmed. Precisely the scenario that current disaster response planning has historically assumed wouldn't happen. Given all of this, it's worth spending real time on what California has actually built to prepare for exactly this scenario, because the state hasn't been sitting idle while these studies accumulate, and understanding that existing infrastructure is genuinely part of the full picture rather than an afterthought tacked onto the end of a scary headline. It's because the state hasn't been sitting idle while these studies accumulate. California operates the nation's first earthquake early warning system called Shake Alert, launched in 2019 and available to the public free of charge through the MyShake app, along with wireless emergency alerts pushed directly to phones. The system works by detecting the faster-moving, less destructive P waves that a rupture generates first, then immediately transmitting a warning ahead of the slower, more damaging NS waves that actually cause the majority of shaking damage. In practice, that can mean anywhere from a few seconds to as much as a minute or more of advance warning, depending on how far a person is from the epicenter, enough time to drop, take cover, and hold on before the worst shaking arrives, enough time for surgeons to pause a procedure, for elevators to stop at the nearest floor and open their doors, and for transit systems to begin automatically slowing trains. The system has already demonstrated real-world value, providing advance notification to millions of residents across Los Angeles, Orange, and Ventura counties ahead of a magnitude 4.7 earthquake near Malibu. California also holds the annual Great California Shakeout, a statewide earthquake drill that has drawn well over 10 million participants in recent years, practicing the simple but genuinely life-saving drop, cover, and hold-on response until it becomes physical muscle memory rather than something people have to consciously think through in the middle of actual disorienting shaking. Governor Gavin Newsom has repeatedly emphasized the same core message driving all of this preparedness infrastructure, that California faces more than a 99% chance of experiencing a magnitude 6.7 or larger earthquakes somewhere in the state within the next 30 years, framing readiness not as a response to any single headline-grabbing study, but as an ongoing permanent responsibility given the landscape the state sits on. It's also worth understanding how these two very different studies, with the 1,000-year stress reconstruction focused on Southern California and the sediment core research focused on the broader West Coast, actually fit together methodologically, because they arrived at their conclusions through completely different scientific approaches, which is part of what gives the combined picture its weight. Burkhard's team worked from physics-based modeling, essentially building a computer simulation of how stress accumulates and releases across a fault system over time, calibrated against geological evidence like radiocarbon dating and historical earthquake records, then projected forward to estimate present-day conditions. Goldfinger's team worked from direct physical evidence instead, actual sediment cores pulled from the ocean floor, containing a literal physical record of past underwater landslides triggered by ancient earthquakes, dated and cross-referenced across two separate fault systems located hundreds of miles apart. One approach is essentially predictive modeling grounded in physics. The other is closer to detective work, reading a buried physical record left behind by real historical events. When two entirely different scientific methods, developed by separate research teams working independently of each other, converge on a similar conclusion, that elevated risk and cross-fault triggering are both plausible and worth serious planning attention. The convergence carries more scientific weight than either finding wood on its own. So where does that leave the actual takeaway? Especially with headlines this week using words like chilling and framing this as some kind of imminent countdown. The honest version is this: nothing in any of this research indicates that a major earthquake is confirmed to strike within days, or even within any specific, identifiable window at all. What the research does show, consistently and from multiple independent angles, is that the underlying hazard is real, well-documented, and arguably more concerning in its potential scale than the standard single-fault big one scenario that's dominated public imagination for decades, given the newly demonstrated possibility of Cascadia and the San Andreas triggering each other, and given the specific mechanics of how a rupture could cross through Cajon Pass and combine two major fault systems into one significantly larger event. Treating this as reason for genuine panic isn't supported by what the scientists themselves are actually saying, but treating it as just another recycled disaster headline to scroll past would be a mistake too, because the specific converging pieces of evidence behind this particular round of coverage are genuinely new, genuinely independent of each other, and genuinely worth taking seriously as a prompt to actually check whether your own emergency plan, your household's supplies, and your family's evacuation and communication plan are current, rather than something you meant to get around to 18 months ago and never quite did. It's also worth noting that none of the preparedness infrastructure described here, Shake Alert, the annual shakeout drill, updated building codes, exists because scientists somehow already know when the next rupture will occur. It exists precisely because they don't, and likely never fully will, which is exactly why building genuine, lasting readiness into everyday life matters more than trying to time a single perfect moment of preparation around any one alarming headline. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If the ground started shaking hard right now, wherever you happen to be reading or listening to this, would you actually know what to do in the first 10 seconds before you'd have time to think it through? Would your household know where to meet if phone networks went down the way they typically do in a major earthquake? That's genuinely the gap researchers, like Lucy Jones, have spent their entire careers trying to close, not by predicting the unpredictable, but by making sure that when the unpredictable eventually happens, exactly as it inevitably will on a long enough timeline, the response is already rehearsed rather than improvised in a moment of panic. It's worth remembering, too, that preparedness in this context isn't a single checklist item to complete once and forget about. It's a household habit that needs occasional revisiting, checking whether stored water and food are still within their usable dates, confirming that emergency contacts and out-of-area meeting points are still accurate, and making sure every member of a household, including kids, actually knows the drop, cover, and hold on response well enough to do it automatically rather than needing to be told in the moment. Let me know in the comments whether you live somewhere near an active fault system, and how seriously you've actually taken earthquake preparedness compared to how seriously you probably should. If this breakdown helped you separate the real science in this story from the exaggerated version currently spreading across social media, share it with someone who could use the clearer picture, and subscribe for more deep dives that cut through disaster headlines to explain what the actual research says, because this particular story, given everything we just walked through, is not going away anytime soon, and the fault systems at the center of it are not waiting for anyone's schedule.